NASCAR champion Kyle Busch, his family revealing he died from severe pneumonia that then progressed into sepsis.
Dale Earnhardt Jr. reveals Kyle Busch's final moments after tragic death. There are rivalries in sports that define entire eras. Rivalries so deep, so personal, so layered with history that they become inseparable from the sport itself. And then, every so often, a rivalry that once burned with pure bitterness quietly transforms into something else entirely. Something that looks a lot like friendship. That is the story of Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Kyle Busch. Not the version most fans knew, with the wrecks and the pointed media comments and the decades of tension simmering through garage areas and post-race press scrums. The other version, the one that was still being written just one day before Kyle Busch died. On May 27, 2026, Dale Earnhardt Jr. sat down for the latest episode of his podcast, The Dale Jr. Download. And what he shared stopped NASCAR fans cold. Not because it was dramatic in the Hollywood sense. Not because it involved controversy or conflict. It stopped people cold because it was quiet and personal, and it pointed towards something extraordinary that the sport never got to witness. Dale Jr. spoke about the final text message conversation he had with Kyle Busch, a conversation that was happening on Tuesday, May 20th. While one man was smiling at an arcade with his son and the other was unaware that his friend was about to collapse on a bathroom floor the very next day. What Earnhardt revealed in that podcast episode reframed the entire final chapter of Kyle Busch's life. And to fully understand why those words hit so hard, you have to start at the beginning, at the part of the story where these two men wanted nothing to do with each other. A rivalry that went all the way to the bone. To understand the weight of everything Dale Jr. said about Kyle Busch after his death, you have to go back to 2007. Not because that was when the rivalry started, there had been friction between them before that, but because 2007 was when it became something personal and structural, something that would follow both drivers around for nearly a decade. At the end of the 2007 season, Rick Hendrick made the decision that sent shockwaves through the NASCAR world. He released Kyle Busch from Hendrick Motorsports, and the reason was straightforward and completely public. The team was making room for Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was leaving Dale Earnhardt Incorporated after the death of his father's company to join NASCAR's most celebrated organization. From that moment forward, whether either man liked it or not, the narrative of their relationship was permanently colored by that transaction. Dale Jr. got the seat. Kyle Busch got pushed out the door. And Junior Nation, one of the largest and most passionate fan bases in American motorsports, made Kyle Busch their villain almost from the moment he started his new chapter at Joe Gibbs Racing. Then came Richmond in 2008. If there was a single moment that crystallized the feud for casual fans and made it something that went beyond normal racing competition, it was that race. Kyle Busch and Dale Earnhardt Jr. were battling for position late in the race when contact between their cars wrecked Dale Jr. The incident was visible. It was clear on television, and it ignited an already combustible situation. Junior Nation erupted. Kyle Busch was booed at virtually every track he visited for the next several years. And Dale Earnhardt Jr. himself admitted years later that the rivalry had gotten inside his head in a way that was genuinely damaging to his performance. In an interview he gave in 2019, he was open about it. He said the rivalry had been unhealthy for him personally. He said he spent a couple of years consumed with getting Busch back, instead of focusing on winning races. He called it not good for him as a driver. That level of honest self-reflection tells you how deep the rivalry had cut. When a professional athlete says that thinking about a rival took his focus away from his own job, that is not a normal sporting competition. That is something that got under the skin and stayed there. For years, the garage at NASCAR races was a place where these two men simply coexisted with tension between them. Media appearances would occasionally stoke the flames. Comments would be paused for shade. The natural theater of the sport kept their names connected in ways neither of them seemed to fully enjoy. And by the time Dale Earnhardt Jr. retired from full-time Cup competition after the 2017 season, a retirement forced partly by a series of concussions that had severely impacted his health, the two men were still carrying that history with them wherever they went. But that is not where the story ends. Not even close. The conversation in the bus, in the tribute that Dale Earnhardt Jr. posted on X shortly after Kyle Busch's death was confirmed on May 21, 2026, he wrote words that were careful and honest and clearly came from a man still processing an enormous shock. He acknowledged that he and Kyle had what he called a really challenging existence for many years. Anyone who followed the sport already understood exactly what that meant. But then he wrote the part that changed the entire tone of the tribute. He said that Kyle had been the one to make the first move. It was Kyle Busch who walked into Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s motorhome one day and started a conversation about how each of them managed their racing teams. That was the door opener. That was the moment when two men who had spent the better part of a decade making each other's professional lives more difficult decided to try something completely different. And the fact that it was Kyle who initiated it matters. The public narrative around Kyle Busch during his peak rivalry years with Dale Jr. had cast him as the antagonist, the driver who didn't care what fans thought, the one who raced hard and said what he wanted and let the chips fall where they may. And yet, when it came to repairing an important relationship in his life, Kyle Busch was the one who walked through the door first and started the conversation. Earnhardt was clear about this. He said Kyle instigated the reconciliation with a conversation in his bus about how they each managed their racing teams. He said he was super eager for them to get on better terms. That single detail carries tremendous weight because it reveals the private Kyle Busch, the one who, away from cameras and fan expectations and the constructed persona of Rowdy, was willing to do the uncomfortable work of repairing something broken. After that conversation, the two men began building something they had never had before. They did media appearances together. Earnhardt said they were able to sit down and actually laugh about the things they had put each other through over the years. For fans who remembered the intensity of that rivalry at its peak, the image of Kyle Busch and Dale Earnhardt Jr. laughing together about shared history would have been surreal. But it was real. It was happening. And it was setting the stage for something that would have given NASCAR fans one of the most genuinely feel-good stories the sport had seen in years. The plan that never happened. On his podcast episode following the Coca-Cola 600 weekend, Earnhardt revealed the detail that broke people all over again. He had been texting with Kyle Busch the day before Kyle died. Not a goodbye message. Not anything heavy or significant in the moment. They were texting about a race car and a seat fitting and a plan that both men were clearly excited about. Kyle Busch had agreed to drive one of Junior Motorsports' late model cars in the Cars Tour race at North Wilkesboro Speedway, scheduled for July 17th. North Wilkesboro, a track that had been rescued from decades of abandonment and revived as one of NASCAR's most beloved venues. The plan was for Kyle to come by the Junior Motorsports shop that very Thursday to get his seat fitted in the late model. That meeting was set. The details were being confirmed in text messages on the Tuesday before Kyle died on Thursday morning. But the detail that made even the most composed fans take a moment to collect themselves was the car number. Kyle Busch didn't just want to drive any JRM car. He specifically asked to run the Dale Jr. number 8, the same iconic number that Dale Earnhardt Jr. had made famous during his career. The number that now lived at Junior Motorsports in its classic DI font after Dale Jr. reclaimed ownership of it. And when Earnhardt told him the number 8 was exactly what was available, Kyle reportedly laughed about what the reaction of both fan bases would be. Two camps of NASCAR fans who had spent years being divided by the rivalry between these two men would suddenly be cheering for the exact same driver in the exact same car at one of the sport's most beloved tracks. He thought that was hilarious. And it would have been. It would have been one of those spontaneous NASCAR moments that transcend the sport, the kind of story that gets told for decades in garage conversations and at race weekends, and in the type of documentary that someone makes 20 years from now about this era of the sport. The Thursday meeting was supposed to happen on May 29th. Kyle Busch died on May 21st. 8 days separated the sport from a moment that would have been talked about forever. The radio call nobody understood in time. Now go back 11 days before any of this. Back to Sunday, May 10th, at Watkins Glen International in upstate New York. Kyle Busch was driving the number 8 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing in the Cup Series event, and for the first time in what had been a difficult season, his car was genuinely fast. He was running inside the top 10, moving through traffic, looking like the driver that Joe Gibbs Racing fans remembered from the championship years. Then, with just a few laps remaining in the race, Kyle keyed his radio. He asked his team to track down a specific doctor, Bill Heisel from Ortho, Carolina. He said he needed a shot after the race and specified that he wanted the doctor to meet him at his motorhome rather than at his car. The call went out live on the Fox Sports broadcast, and commentator Mike Joy explained it to millions of viewers in the most reasonable way anyone could have explained it at the time. Kyle had been fighting what appeared to be a sinus cold all week. Watkins Glen is a demanding road course with significant elevation changes and high G-forces that can turn any kind of sinus or head pressure into genuine physical misery. Kyle finished the race in 8th place, his best Cup result of the entire 2026 season. Everyone moved on. But Bill Heisel is not a generic track medic. He is the director of motorsports medicine at Ortho Carolina, and one of the most respected medical providers in the entire NASCAR garage. Drivers do not ask for Bill Heisel by name unless they know exactly who he is and exactly what kind of care they need. Kyle knew. And on that same day, May 10th, his daughter Lennox was celebrating her 4th birthday at home. While a 4-year-old was having her birthday, her father was at a racetrack 2 states away asking a doctor for help with what seemed at the time like a manageable sinus issue. What nobody knew then was that the infection building inside Kyle Busch's body was already far more serious than a sinus cold. According to the death certificate later obtained by multiple outlets, including The Athletic and US Weekly, Kyle had been suffering from bacterial pneumonia for a period described as days to weeks prior to his death. That means the illness that eventually killed him may have been taking hold of his body around the time of Watkins Glen, or even before. The shot he asked for after the race, the discomfort he was clearly managing, these were not minor inconveniences. They were early symptoms of something that was already escalating inside him. 5 days after Watkins Glen, Kyle would be in victory lane. 5 days after Watkins Glen, he would say words that nobody who heard them could have possibly understood at the time. The last win and the words that echo. On Friday, May 15th, 2026, Kyle Busch walked into Dover Motor Speedway and drove like the greatest Truck Series competitor in the history of the sport, which is exactly what he was. He qualified on pole for the EcoSafe 200. He dominated the race. He led 147 of 200 laps and swept both stages. He crossed the finish line more than 3 seconds ahead of the field to take his 69th career NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series victory, extending a record that may never be approached by any driver in the history of the series. After the race, Fox Sports reporter Amanda Busick asked Kyle Busch why winning never gets old. His answer, delivered with a smile in victory lane, is now one of the most haunting quotes in the history of the sport. He said that you take whatever you can get, because you never know when the last one is going to be. He told people to cherish them all. He said to trust him on that. Then, in a separate press availability a few minutes later, a reporter asked how many more wins he was chasing in his career. He gave essentially the same answer again. You never know when the last one is going to be. Twice in the same post-race session. 6 days before he died, Kyle Busch stood in victory lane at Dover and told the racing world to cherish every moment because nothing is guaranteed. Drivers say things like this. Athletes talk about appreciating wins because the competitive window doesn't last forever. Kyle Busch at 41, coming off a difficult stretch in Cup where wins had become harder to find, had every honest reason to reflect on the preciousness of victory lane moments. He was not speaking from a place of premonition. He was speaking from the place of a veteran competitor who understood how fleeting success in motorsports can be. But context changes everything. And when you hear those words now, when you watch that interview back knowing that 6 days later Kyle Busch was gone, they do not sound like a cliché. They sound like something else entirely. The following day, Saturday, May 16th, Kyle spoke to reporters at Dover again and admitted that he was still not feeling right. He said the cough from the week before had been substantial and that he still was not great. Nobody in that media scrum treated it as alarming news. Drivers get sick. Drivers race through illness. That is the culture of NASCAR. A culture built on toughness and the fundamental expectation that you show up and compete regardless of what your body is telling you. Kyle Busch had spent 22 full-time seasons embodying that culture. Nobody thought twice about it. The last birthday. The last post. On Monday, May 18th, Kyle Busch's son Brexton turned 11 years old. Kyle posted a carousel of birthday photos on Instagram. Images of Brexton growing up on racetracks, standing in victory lanes, becoming the young man that his father so clearly adored. The caption Kyle wrote spoke of how proud he and Samantha were of who Brexton was becoming. He talked about there being no limit to what the kid could accomplish. That Instagram post is still there. It was Kyle Busch's last post on social media. 3 days before he died, he was being a father and telling the world how proud he was of his son. That same day, Samantha Busch posted her own tribute to Brexton on his birthday. She wrote about watching him grow into this driven, funny, kind-hearted young man. She called it the greatest gift. She said that no matter how tall he gets or how fast he drives, he would always be her baby. 3 days later, Samantha Busch would lose her husband. Those words were written in pure joy. They now exist inside grief. The next morning, Tuesday, May 19th, Kyle and Brexton drove to Durham, North Carolina for the grand opening of an Andretti indoor karting facility. Mario Andretti himself was present at the event, sharing stories and shaking hands. A man named Nazidura, who was at the event and later spoke to local media, said he saw Kyle and Brexton playing arcade games together. He said the bond between them was impossible to miss, and that he did not want to interrupt because the moment felt too special to disturb. Kyle was laughing. He was present. He was with his kid. Mario Andretti later pulled out his phone at Indianapolis Motor Speedway to show reporters a video from that exact event. Kyle Busch smiling, shaking his hand, being the warm and engaged person that the public version of his rowdy persona often obscured. Andretti called Kyle's death the shock of his life. He said everybody knew Rowdy and that Kyle would always bring a smile to any conversation about him. That was Tuesday. Kyle Busch was laughing and playing arcade games with his son and shaking hands with one of the greatest names in the history of motorsport. The same Tuesday that he was texting Dale Earnhardt Jr. about seat fittings and car numbers and a race at North Wilkesboro that both of them were clearly looking forward to. Wednesday evening in Concord. On Wednesday, May 20th, Kyle Busch drove to the General Motors Charlotte Technical Center in Concord, North Carolina, for simulator work. This was completely routine. Chevrolet teams use that facility constantly for engineering sessions and race preparation. Richard Childress Racing relied on it regularly. There was nothing unusual about Kyle Busch being there on a Wednesday afternoon in May. At approximately 5:30 in the evening, someone at the facility called 911. The Cabarrus County Sheriff's Office later released the audio of that call, and it was obtained and reported by ABC News. The caller, speaking calmly, told the dispatcher that there was an individual experiencing shortness of breath who was very hot and believed he was going to pass out. The caller told the dispatcher the individual was producing blood and coughing up blood. He said the person was lying on the bathroom floor but was conscious and awake. He repeated multiple times that the individual was awake. He asked that the paramedics come in without sirens and directed them to a side entrance. Kyle Busch was transported from the Concord facility to a hospital in the Charlotte area. The specific hospital was never publicly confirmed by any official source. That 911 call is the most significant piece of public medical documentation in this entire story. It is the only recorded moment where we hear in real time what was actually happening to Kyle Busch's body before he died. Everything that came before. The sinus cold at Watkins Glen, the request for Dr. Heisel, the cough he mentioned at Dover, the general sense that he was not feeling great, those were all signs of something that had been building. The bathroom floor in Concord was the moment the illness finally overwhelmed him. By Thursday morning, the world would learn that Kyle Busch was not coming back. The final hours and the racing world's response. On Thursday morning, May 21st, 2026, a statement appeared on Kyle's social media accounts from his family. It said he had experienced a severe illness resulting in hospitalization and that he would not be competing at Charlotte Motor Speedway that weekend. Richard Childress Racing announced Austin Hill as his replacement for the Coca-Cola 600. The RCR statement said the number 8 Chevrolet would be ready and waiting for Kyle when he recovered. A few hours later, everything changed. A joint statement from the Busch family, Richard Childress Racing, and NASCAR confirmed that Kyle Busch had died. The statement called him a future Hall of Famer, a rare talent, one who comes along once in a generation. It expressed heartbreak on behalf of the entire NASCAR family. The cause of death listed was severe illness, 2 words that gave the world nothing concrete to hold on to. That changed on Saturday, May 23rd, when Kyle's family released a fuller statement through Dakota Hunter, vice president of Kyle Busch Companies. The statement confirmed what the death certificate would later document in clinical detail. Severe pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, resulting in rapid and overwhelming associated complications. The death certificate, obtained by outlets including US Weekly and The Athletic, revealed that Kyle had been suffering from bacterial pneumonia for a period described as days to weeks before his death. The infection progressed into sepsis, the body's extreme, life-threatening response to infection, where the immune system goes into overdrive and begins damaging the body's own organs and tissues. The sepsis then caused disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is abnormal clotting throughout the blood vessels, reducing blood flow to vital organs. That led to hemorrhagic shock from severe bleeding. Kyle Busch died at 4:37 in the afternoon on May 21, 2026. He was 41 years old. NASCAR CEO Steve O'Donnell held a press conference at Charlotte Motor Speedway the following day. He called Kyle an American badass. He said Kyle would probably want them to race that weekend, so they were going to honor his memory by doing exactly that. When asked about the cause of death, O'Donnell said they were still only 24 hours removed from the news, and that out of respect for the family he would not address specifics at that time. But he shared one final detail that silenced the room. He said Kyle had texted him on Tuesday, the same day he was at the Andretti event with Brexton, the same day he was texting Dale Earnhardt Jr. about seat fittings. That text too. O'Donnell asked what O'Donnell thought about an over 40 rule that would allow Kyle to compete in all the Truck Series races the following year. O'Donnell said they had actually discussed the idea internally at NASCAR on Wednesday, while Kyle was collapsing in a facility less than 30 minutes away, and agreed it sounded like a good idea. Richard Childress Racing announced they would retire the number 8 indefinitely. In a detail that carried its own historical echo, RCR said the number 8 was being reserved for Braxton Busch for when he was ready to go NASCAR racing, a direct parallel to what the organization did with Dale Earnhardt Sr.'s number 3 after Daytona in 2001, when that number was set aside until Austin Dillon was old enough to carry it. What Dale Earnhardt Jr. said that mattered most. When Dale Earnhardt Jr. posted his tribute on X on the day Kyle died, he did not reach for easy words. He did not post a generic farewell or a Bible verse or career highlight. He told a story. He wrote that Kyle had been the one to initiate the reconciliation between them. He wrote that they had taken the time to work through a really challenging existence, and that Kyle had made the first move. He said they had even done media together and laughed about what they had put each other through. And then he wrote about the plan, North Wilkesboro, the late model, the seat fitting scheduled for that Thursday. He wrote that he would never be able to make sense of the loss, but that he was thankful they had found a way to become friends. On the podcast episode a week later, he went deeper. He described the text exchange from the day before Kyle died. Two men making plans about a race car and a car number and a date in July when the fans of both drivers were going to have to stand in the same grandstands and cheer for the same person. He talked about how Kyle had laughed at that image. He talked about how excited Kyle had been about the whole idea. What Earnhardt shared was not a dramatic deathbed revelation. It was something quieter and in many ways more powerful. It was the picture of a friendship still being built, still in progress, still gaining momentum, still full of possibilities, cut off before it reached the moment that would have defined it publicly. The race at North Wilkesboro was going to be the visible culmination of a reconciliation that had been happening privately for years. It was going to be the moment when the rest of the world got to see what these two men had become to each other. It never happened. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with unfinished things. Not the grief of losing what existed, though that grief is enormous, but the grief of losing what was still being built. The grief of a Thursday meeting that will never be kept. The grief of a car number that will never be on the track for the reason it was supposed to be. The grief of a joke between two former rivals about their fans having to cheer together that will now only ever exist as a memory in one man's mind. A brother's silence and a legacy that can't be measured. Tributes came from everywhere. Denny Hamlin, who had raced alongside Kyle at Joe Gibbs Racing for so many years, called him the Kobe Bryant of racing, a comparison that understood exactly what Kyle Busch represented in terms of competitive excellence and the complicated public relationship that genius often generates. Brad Keselowski told people to hug their loved ones. Jimmy Johnson called Kyle one of the most talented drivers he had ever shared a racetrack with. William Byron said Kyle was the best mentor anyone could ask for. Joe Gibbs Racing said their hearts were broken. Rick Hendrick said he had watched Kyle grow up in the sport. But one voice has remained quiet. Kate Busch, Kyle's older brother. The man who told the world back in 2001 that his little brother was the best driver in the family. The man whose own Hall of Fame career ended in 2023 because of a concussion he was never able to recover from. The man who stood on the red carpet at the NASCAR Hall of Fame just 4 months before his brother died when Kurt was inducted in January of 2026 with Kyle right there beside him, has not posted anything. His Instagram is silent. His X account is silent. The joint statement from NASCAR named him alongside Samantha, Braxton, and Lennox, but Kurt himself has not yet found the words. And honestly, how could he? How do you write a post about the kid you told the whole world was better than you? The kid who went on to prove you right 234 times across 3 different national series. The kid who won 2 Cup championships, 69 Truck Series races, 63 Cup victories, and became the winningest driver in NASCAR history across all 3 major series. The kid who outlived your career by 3 full years, and then did not outlive you. Kyle Busch won his final race on a Friday at Dover. He celebrated his son's birthday on a Monday. He played arcade games with Brexton and shook hands with Mario Andretti on a Tuesday. He was texting about race cars and seat fittings and rules changes on Tuesday evening. He collapsed on a Wednesday. He was gone on a Thursday. 41 years old. 2 championships. 234 wins. A wife who had been with him since 2008. A son who wants to be just like him. A daughter who had just turned 4 years old. And a story with Dale Earnhardt Jr. that was supposed to have one more chapter. A seat fitting, a late model, a July night at North Wilkesboro, and 2 sets of fans being forced to cheer for the same driver. That chapter will never be written. Kyle Busch stood in victory lane at Dover 6 days before he died and told the world you never know when the last one is going to be. He told people to cherish every one. He said to trust him on that. He had no way of knowing how right he was. Nobody ever does. That is the hardest part of all of this. Not just that he is gone, but that he was in the middle of something, in the middle of a friendship, in the middle of a plan, in the middle of a conversation, and then he was simply not there anymore. 11 days from a radio call at Watkins Glen to a hospital in Charlotte. 11 days from what sounded like a sinus cold to the end of a career that defined a generation of the sport. Cherish them all. Trust him on that.